here that they take the time and they make the holiday to holiday. Holiday to holiday. To holiday, huh? Mr. Hashem. Today the shiur is for the Shlema of Diana Bat Rachel, that is Rachmu Shamayim, and for the Shama of Tuba Bat Yochi Chai. And Mr. Hashem, we would like to appreciate whatever Rabbi Sauer does for us. You know, Rabbi Sauer comes here very often, and Baruch Hashem, we have that Shaykhut. I just wanted to mention something also. We are making a Beit Hamidrash on Tuesday night. Every Tuesday night, 8 to 9, we would like to have a community learning. We would like to have everybody learning here. Eno dome, mu'atim asukim beTorah, merubim asukim beTorah. It's not dome. When a lot of people are learning Torah, or some people, we said Hashem make a note that 8 to 9, Tuesday, don't put any appointment, nothing. Kodesh HaKodashim. 8 to 9, Tuesday, tell your wife, your family, everybody, that this time is for learning. We want B'ezrat Hashem to have a community-wide. Everybody from the community should be here for learning Torah. And Baruch Hashem, Rabbi Sauer, we know there's Al Bedin of our Sisi. Baruch Hashem, we get a lot of benefit from Rabbi Sauer of Bedin. And it's very interesting that we learned Hilchot Tzedka 10, 12 years ago when we came here to Kollel. I called Rabbi Sauer, we just came in town, and I said, I need a Mareh Mekomot, we need, references for learning. And Baruch Hashem, Rabbi Sauer, very kindly, he shares his Torah with everybody. Mareh Mekomot, that he works so hard, he said, this is my shiur, invite me to give Mareh Mekomot here. Very interesting that I see Rabbi Sauer, that he's very generous about his Torah. He shares it with everybody. I guess his mentality is, the Torah is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He gave it to me to share it with other people. I think this mahalech that Rabbi Sauer is thinking about this Torah, we should think also about our wealth. Our wealth is a gift from Hashem. And we have to share it with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Unfortunately, a lot of times, I hear in the community, people come and tell me, Rabbi, I gave tzedakah. Do you know how much tzedakah I give? Why this happened? Why that happened? Why is it like that? People have a perspective that tzedakah is a tax. You pay a tax and everything has to be free, People feel it's my money, I made it, and I'm nice enough to share that with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give to Hashem. But the Mishnah in Avot says no. The Raza ben Ish Bartuta Omer Ten Lo Mishelo. You have to give him from his Shata B'Shelcha Shelo, because you and whatever that you have, it belongs to him. It's not a pshat that, this 100% money belongs to me, 10% I share it with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it gives me allowance to use the rest. No. Everything belongs to Hashem. All belongs to him. Like the 10 lo mishelo. It's a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now Hashem tells us how to use it. Hashem says, the limitation that you could give, limitation that you should use for yourself. And this is the right perspective, hashkafa perspective that we should have. I'm sure that Rabbi Sauer would add some hashkafa point into it, but it's a great pleasure to have you here speaking for our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Levi Chaim. That was a perfect introduction for my introduction. And I was asked to come and give not just a shiur on Tzedka and Kesafim, but I think it was called a workshop. So it's a little bit longer than a shiur, and we'll be going through many different areas of this very complex topic, which has many different aspects to it. But I'd like to start off with a story about Reb Chaim Volozhin. And Chazal tell us, Aser ti'aser, Aser bishvil shetish asher. that if a person gives tzedakah, so then he is going to be zoiche to wealth. That will be his schar, his reward. And the Chaim Volozhin, who was a Talmid of the Vilna Gaon, was very, very stringent in giving the exact amount of tzedakah. He didn't only give meiser, a tenth, but he gave a fifth of his earnings. And the story is told that one day he was sitting in his study and he was making calculations for tzedakah purposes. And there was a certain sum of money that he wasn't sure whether he should add it to the tzedakah pile or not. And after thinking about it, he decided that he didn't have to add it to tzedakah. He finished his calculations and he went back to learning. And then he was interrupted a short time later by a knock on the door. Reb Chaim called out permission to enter, and there was a non-Jewish young boy who used to draw water from the well in the village for Reb Chaim. And he stood there in front of the door and he looked very, very forlorn. And Reb Chaim asked him, "What's the matter?" So he said almost with his eyes facing the ground, that I lost your bucket and your axe. This morning when I went down to the well with the bucket fell into the well. I couldn't reach the bucket with my hands. So I came back here to fetch the axe, that the axe would extend my hand, I'd be able to pull the bucket out of the well, but the axe also fell into the well. And now I've lost both the bucket and the axe. So Chaim calmed him down and he told him, don't worry about it. And Chaim started thinking, like, why did I deserve this monetary loss, that I lost the bucket and the axe? And then Chaim asked the young boy, what's the cost of the bucket and the axe? What's its value? And the young boy told him the exact value. And then Reb Chaim went back to his tzedakah notebook, and he realized that the bucket and the axe were exactly equal in value, the sum of money that he had just decided to withhold from giving to tzedakah. So after he sent the young man away, Reb Chaim immediately took that amount of money that he had withheld from tzedakah, and he put it back with the rest of the tzedakah money. A few minutes later, he hears another knock on the door. He opens the door, and the young man is smiling, a big grin on his face, and he's holding the bucket and the axe. And he's so excited, and he says, Rabina, a miracle just happened. My friend went down to the well to draw water, and he found the bucket and the axe floating on the surface of the well. And he returned it to me. So Reb Chaim Volozhin realized that once he returned the money that he had owed to tzedakah, there was no need for him to have that loss of money and to have that financial loss. And so it happened that the bucket and the axe were returned to him. And he always used to tell over this story, and he would say to people, if people would check their personal actions for any trace of not doing the mitzvah, not giving the proper amount of tzedakah, they would be safe from financial loss. And he experienced this, he saw this bechush. And the explanation for this, Reb Shimon Shkop, one of the great Rosh Yeshivas, gives us a very, very interesting insight into why is it aser b'shvil shetis asher, that if a person gives ma'aseh, his reward is going to be wealth. Why is it so? And Reb Shimon Shkop explains, so we all have to realize this. Reb Levi Chaim said, the money is not ours. The money that we have, the money that we earn, we are treasurers, we are trustees for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's money. And if a person's a treasurer, and he proves that he's honest and diligent in controlling the royal funds, he'll be put in charge of more and more of the king's funds, of the king's finances. He's working for the king, after all. We're working for the Melech Malchi Amlochim, the king of all kings. And therefore he said, that's the explanation of the Aser B'Shvil Tzatish Asher. It makes perfect sense, measure for measure. If we take the money that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us as trustees, as his treasurer, and we use it in the proper way, so then HaKadosh Baruch, and we acknowledge that this wealth belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that we're really only a treasurer of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so then the king will give us more and more money. He will see that we are faithful, loyal treasurer for the king, for the Melech Malchi HaMelachim, and he will give more money into the hands of the loyal treasurer. So that's the basic idea in terms of giving tzedakah. It's a mitzvah. We don't do mitzvahs in order to receive reward. The reward will come. But here the Torah says, here Chazal say, aser ta'aser, the Torah phrases it in such a way, aser bishvil shetis asher, that the reward, the consequences of giving meiser, that we'll talk about this morning, is that a person will receive a reward of osher, of wealth. So I want to focus on a number of different areas this morning. First of all, the chiyuv of tzedakah and of ma'aseh kesafim, how one determines, how one calculates ma'aseh kesafim, and distribution. What do you use your ma'aseh kesafim for? So let's start off with the mitzvah of tzedakah. Tzedakah is written in the Torah. There's a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah lo saseh. Pasar tiftach es yodcha, you shall open your hand and give to a poor person. Lo sa'amitz es levavcha, v'lo sikbos es yodcha, me'achicha evyon. Don't harden your heart, don't close your heart, don't close your hand from your brother who is poor. And if a poor person comes to someone asking him for tzedakah, not to give tzedakah is in violation of the mitzvah saseh and of two mitzvahs lo saseh in addition. There's a pasuk in Mishlei, al yoshuv dach nichlom, don't turn away the oppressed in shame. If a poor person approaches you and asks you for some donation, right, just to ignore him and turn him away in shame is also a violation of that pasuk. So the ikar mitzvah of tzedakah is when a poor person approaches you, you cannot turn him away. You have to give him something. You have to, as we'll see a little later on, you must give him something. And but what about all the envelopes that we receive in the mail, right? So over the year we receive hundreds and hundreds of envelopes with requests for tzedakah. So there are many poskim who say that since the poor person is not approaching personally, it's not approaching you personally, it's only through an envelope, whether it's from an institution or it's from an individual, for Harav Kala, to pay off his debts, to pay medical bills, that one is not in violation if they don't send anything back, because there is no, you're not turning him away when he has that personal request. There are some posting, the Debretzina Rav, who says that if you know that this is reliable because it comes with a letter from a reliable rabbi, from a reliable Rav, that he really has a need. So the Debretzina says you should send something. You should send something back. But the most poskim hold, consensus of opinion is you pick and choose whatever you want to send back, and if you don't send back for certain envelopes that you receive in the mail, so then that was the psak of Rav Yashiv and many other poskim, you're not in violation. What happens if they send you a gift in the mail? They send you all kinds of gifts that they send. I remember there was one yeshiva that used to send charoses for the Seder. They would send charoses, or they would send Hanukkah candles. Today they don't do that anymore. But there are still institutions that send gifts. So what do? If you don't want to, do you have to send something back, or you don't have to send gifts? You don't send anything back. Can you keep the gift? Can you use the gift? So once again, most poskim say that you can keep the gift even if you're not sending anything back. They're sending it as a gift. It's not conditional. That only if you send the money back, it's an incentive. They hope that you'll send something if they send you a gift. There are some poskim who say that if you don't send anything back, you shouldn't use it, but you don't have to pay postage to send this back. You can just put it on your shelf and leave it there. without using it. But again, the majority opinion is that you can use the gift, whether it's a luach, it's a sefer, it's a booklet. You can that's charoses. You can use the gift even if you don't intend to send anything back. So the Torah says that there is a mitzvah to give tzedakah. The mitzvah tzedakah, the Torah says, is dei machsoro asher yechsar lo. Whatever the poor person needs. That's the mitzvah. If he needs money to buy a house, he needs money to pay for a chasana for his daughter, that's dei machsoro. However, there's a very important stipulation and qualification on that. That's only if the poor person is coming to an individual, he's embarrassed or he's not capable of going around door to door and asking many people, right? And he comes to an individual who's capable of giving him dei machsor, whatever his needs are. But if he's mechazer al apsochim, if he goes door to door, as most of the mishulachim do today, right? They go around to many people, whether it's in the shuls or they go door to door to the homes. So then all you have to give is a matana muetes, a small gift. Even though he might need $10,000 for his daughter's wedding, right? You don't have, even if you're capable of giving that amount, you're not obligated to give that amount. You only have to give a small gift, with a small gift, $5, $10, $18, $25, whatever a person feels that he's capable of giving, that he wants to give. But you don't have to give dei machsor, whatever his needs are. And the many poskim say that the chiyuv of dei machsor, of fulfilling the needs, is not an obligation on the individual, but it's an obligation on the community. If a poor person comes and he says, I need $10,000 for my daughter's wedding, right? So then the community possibly has the obligation to raise those funds for him, but not an individual. There is an opinion that holds that if the community is not capable, or there is no community there, that the individual would be chayav. But the majority opinion is that dei machsoro is not an obligation on the individual; it's an obligation on the community, and especially if the poor person is going door to door and asking for funds for many different people, you have to give a small gift. Whatever you feel is appropriate in that case. Now, in addition to the chiyuv of tzedakah, when one is approached by an ani, that you have to give them something, there is also another chiyuv, another obligation of ma'aseh kesafim, of giving a tenth of one's income, even if you're not being approached. You're not being approached by an ani, but you know that there are poor people, there are institutions, there are yeshivas and kollelim that need funding, that need money. So one has an obligation of giving ma'aseh kesafim, 1/10 of one's income. That's a midah beinanis. That's sort of mediocre. That's an average amount. But a chomesh is a mitzvah min hamuvcha. It's preferable if a person is capable of giving a fifth of his income, and that is a mitzvah min hamuvcha. So a meiser, a tenth, or possibly a fifth if one is capable and one gets greater schar, of course, if they give a fifth. Even a poor person is obligated to give tzedakah. Even a poor person who's defined as an oni in halacha, he has to give a minimum amount of tzedakah over the year. That's shlishis shekel lashona, a third of a shekel, which is approximately the value of 4 2/3 grams of silver. Silver is pretty expensive, has been pretty expensive recently. So 4 2 grams, it's probably $10-15. But even a poor person is not absolved from the mitzvah of tzedakah. According to the Vilna Gaon, a fifth is a chiyuv. A fifth is an obligation. If you're capable of giving a fifth, and you know that there are aniyim around, and there are always poor people around, that we know. So according to the Vilna Gaon, it's an obligation. It's not just a mitzvah min hamuvcha, it's not just preferred. Where do we learn out this obligation of ma'aseh kesafim? We're going to talk about a tenth. Where do we learn out the obligation? So there are 3 possible sources. One possible source is from aser to aser. It's called tevuah zarecha. It's called, you should tithe give a tenth of all of your grain, and Chazal learn from the word kol, that includes not only your grain, the produce of the fields, but that also includes your income from business. Another possible source is from Meiser Oni. Right? There are certain years that one has to give Meiser Oni, a tenth of their grain, to poor people. And Chazal learned from there, not only from the grain, but also from one's income, from one's money. And a third possible source is from Yaakov Avinu. That Yaakov said, Kol asher titen li aser asrenu loch, Hashem, whatever you give to me, I'm going to give a tenth to you. And there is a major machlokes among the poskim whether meiser, giving meiser, is that a chiyuv d'oraisa, is that a chiyuv d'rabanan, or is that a chiyuv is based on minhag. So some poskim hold it's minat Torah, an obligation minat Torah to give meiser. Other poskim hold it's an obligation midrabanan, that's the Chavis Yoyer and the Taz. And then there's a third group of poskim who hold that it's a minhag, but it's a minhag tov. It's a very, very important minhag. Right? We're all makbid on minhagim. This is a minhag that the poskim say that one should definitely be makbid on. It's a minhag that goes back thousands of years. It's traditional. We have a misorah on this minhag and it's a minhag which is really necessary to maintain the aniyim and the institutions within Klal Yisrael. Most poskim hold that it is a minhag. So Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Yashiv, but it's a minhag tov. It's a minhag that one should take on if they are capable of giving, if they're capable of giving ma'isa, and we'll talk about that shortly. If it is a minhag, though, so then if a person does take it on, it becomes like a neder, it becomes like a vow. Because any minhag tov or any chumrah that a person takes on without saying b'li neder, without saying that I'm taking this on not as a vow, it turns into a vow, and therefore it's very, very stringent. Because as a vow, if one doesn't fulfill it, so then one would be in violation of the halachis of nidorim, even though you never said. If a person does it 3 times, gives ma'aseh kesafim, automatically becomes a vow. If a person does it 1 time and he thinks, I'm taking it on as my minhag, without saying b'li neder, that it shouldn't be a vow, it turns into a neder, it turns into a vow. And we all know how chomor, how severe vows, nidorim, and shuas are. So who is obligated to give ma'aseh kesafim? So the Ramah says in Shulchan Aruch, a person is only obligated if he has his own parnosa. If he has parnosas atzmo kodem. If you have your own livelihood, you have your own parnosa, you're able to support yourself, then you're obligated to give ma'aseh kesafim. If a person doesn't have his own parnosa, so then he's potter, he's absolved from ma'aseh kesafim. But what does that mean? That a person has his own parnosa, and on that there is a difference of opinion among the poskim. The Aruch HaShulchan says that as long as a person has subsistence level, day to day, that in other words he has food, lechem tsar umayim lachatz, right? If he has that amount, he's able to survive. He has food from day to day, even though he really is lacking so many other things. So then he's chayiv to give. If he doesn't have that, in other words, if he has to go around begging himself in order to get food for that day, so then he's potter. He doesn't have to give ma'aseh kesafim because he himself doesn't have enough for himself. Parnosas atzmo kodem. That's a klal in halacha. Chayecha kodmim lechaye chavercha. That your life takes precedence over the life of your friend in situations of pikuach nefesh, where there's a life-threatening situation, and so too in terms of giving ma'aseh, that your parnosa, your own sustenance, right? Your own sustenance takes precedence over that of your friend or your neighbor. But what is that? What is the definition of that? So Aruch HaShulchan says subsistence level, that you have enough to eat for that day. The Tzedka Mishpat disagrees. He says that if a person has enough for mizonos, food, clothing, and rent, shelter, right? that's called parnosas atzma. If he doesn't have enough for those three things, right? Three basic needs that a person has: food, clothing, and shelter. If he doesn't have enough for that, he's constantly borrowing. He's constantly in difficulty to pay those basic bills that everyone has. So then that's not parnosas atzma. Then you don't have your own livelihood, and then you would be potter from giving ma'aseh kesafim. There's a third opinion. The Brisker Rav said that whoever lives bidochak, he lives with difficulty, with hardship, that he has to borrow money. He has to borrow money, and he doesn't live a luxurious lifestyle. He lives a lifestyle where he's just really getting by, but not even getting by on his own income. He has to borrow money from relatives, or he has to go to a gemach to borrow money, and he's not living luxuriously. He's living a very, very simple lifestyle. So then, and under those circumstances, he would be potter for ma'aseh kesafim. If a person is making an income, and he's able, he is paying his bills, but if he's not living luxuriously, so then he would be chayiv to give ma'aseh kesafim. Let's hold on. The best thing would be to write down questions, and I'll answer questions afterwards. Okay. That's the basic question of who is obligated to give ma'aseh kesafim. Now, how do we calculate ma'aseh kesafim? How is it calculated? How do we separate ma'aseh kesafim? Before that, just want to mention one thing, that there is a halacha that one is obligated to give a tenth or a fifth, not more than a fifth. Person is not supposed to give more than a fifth of his income, and the reason for that was the takana of the chachamim, that a person himself shouldn't become poor, impoverished as a result of giving tzedka to others, and then he'll have to go around begging from others. Not allowed to give more than a fifth. However, the Chafetz Chaim lists in Havas Chesed 6 exclusions to this. I want to tell you the 6 exclusions. Very, very interesting. There are 6 cases in which you're allowed to give more than a fifth. 1 is for pikuach nefesh, if it's to save a life. 2 is when there are many, many poor people in the community. Then, and there's a tremendous need, because there are so many poor people. People have lost jobs. People don't have income, so then you're allowed to give more than a fifth. Third exclusion is an extremely wealthy person. Bill Gates is allowed to give more than a fifth, right? So he makes $47 billion, right? And his salary, and maybe it's down now. I think he's not the top salary earner anymore. But he's allowed to give more than a fifth. He ain't going to become poor if he gives a fifth of his. If he gives more than a fifth of his income. A fourth case is, I'm going to just go over to the 5th case. The 5th case is hachzokas haTorah, to support Torah. To support Torah, the Shita Muruvetza says you're allowed to give more than a fifth, and the reason for that is very interesting. Because when you support Torah, you become a shutaf, you become a partner. Become a partner, and you receive reward for the limud haTorah that takes place. It's like the Yisachar Zvulun, even though the Yisachar Zvulun contract was not made, right? But Zvulun supported Yisachar in his learning. So anytime one supports Torah, it's like a partnership. And therefore, under those circumstances, you're allowed to give more than a fifth. Just like if you invest in a business, you can give more than a fifth of your assets in the investment because you're a partner. It's a shutfis. And the 6th qualification the Chafetz Chaim gives is Misha b'lavhochim mefazim ma'osav lahavolim. If a person spends his money on all kinds of things that are not so important. If he spends his money on very expensive clothes, very expensive cars, Chafetz Chaim didn't say that cars, but I'm just using modern day examples. Very expensive cars, a very expensive home, and he furnishes the home so beautifully. And he goes on vacations all the time, going out to restaurants all the time, and he has very, 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 very expensive. If a person uses his money for these luxuries, then he's allowed to use the money for the right purposes and spend more than a fifth in giving tzedakah, because he's spending so much money on all of these other things which are not essentials in life. So then he can spend more than a fifth. Okay, that's the Chafetz Chaim right
The
there.
fifth one doesn't mention.
A fifth? The fifth one, yeah, I skipped the fourth one. The fourth one was if a person has a steady income. That's a steady income, and there's no danger that he'll become poor. So then, under those circumstances, he's allowed to give more than a fifth. So how do you figure out? How do you calculate ma'aser? So the Shulchan Aruch says that the first year you take off a tenth from the principal. In other words, let's say a couple gets married, right, and they get a lot of wedding gifts, a lot of money from the wedding. That's their principal. So they have to take off ma'aser. Let's say they made $50,000 on wedding gifts. So then they should take off $5,000 and give that to tzedakah. That's the first year. What do they do with the rest of the money, the $45,000 that's left? So they put it in the bank, right? Or they invest it, and every year they're receiving dividends, interest, or profits on it, right? So then each and every year after that, they have to take off ma'aser from the profits, not from the principal again. The principal is only one time, but the profits or the interest that's earned, they have to take off each and every year after that. And the way it's done is by calculating an accounting period. An accounting period, because there are profits and there are losses. So how do you figure out the net income in terms of what you're obligated to give ma'aser on? So the poskim say, and this is the Chafetz Chaim, the Noida B'Yehuda, the Aruch HaShulchan, to determine the net income on which you're obligated to give ma'aser, what you do is you establish an accounting period for ma'aser. Just like we have a tax year, right, that you're obligated to pay taxes from January to December 31st, whatever income you earned then. So too in terms of ma'aser, you establish an accounting period for ma'aser, the income that you earn during that accounting period, and as we'll see, there's adjustments to that based on deductions, there is losses that in order to determine the net income. And very many people establish this accounting period from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, or from January 1st to December 31st. Many people follow that. It's up to you. It's up to the individual what accounting period you want to establish. Many people will do it from January till December because that's the tax year. Makes things easier in terms of calculations. So we missed it by one day, right? This is for the coming year, right? We should have had this year last week, right? December 25th, so that people would have one more week of last year. But we missed it by one day in terms of. But for the coming year, you'll know exactly how to make the calculations. And during this accounting period, it's going to be based on one's income and also based on the losses and the expenses and the overhead, as we'll see, to determine what's the net income. Very, very similar to the IRS. Very similar. In fact, at the end of this year, I'll give out what's called the ma'aser form. It almost looks like a tax form, right? And to help people calculate what their obligation of ma'aser is in terms of income on side one, and in terms of adjustments to income on side two. Right? This was designed by an accountant who's a Talmid Chacham a number of years ago, and just to make it easier to help people calculate their ma'aser. So this is the period. A person has to establish an accounting period to determine income for Maisa. It could be a whole year, it could be 6 months if one wants to do it that way, 3 months, but one has to be consistent in establishing that period. I always give people an advice that they should have a separate Maisa bank account, a separate checking account for Maisa. Whenever they receive income, right, especially if they receive a salary, take off 10% from the net salary that you're receiving and put it directly into the Tzedka account, into the Maisa account. That just makes things so much easier in terms of writing checks for Maisa, in terms of calculating the Maisa. The Chofetz Chaim wrote that there's a special inyan of giving exactly Maisa. Exactly. Not 9%, not 11%, but to give 10% if a person wants to give more than that, but it's between, let's say, 10 and 20%. 20%, of course, is a chomish, is a fifth. Person wants to give, let's say, 15%. So the Chofetz Chaim said he should stipulate 10% of that as Maisa. The extra 5% I'm giving is just stam tzedakah, but not Maisa, because there's a special, some kind of mystical dimension to giving a tenth, to giving Maisa. Now, so how does one determine income? What's included in income as far as Maisa Kesafim is concerned, right? The simple income that's obvious, of course, is wages that a person receives, profits, salary, interest income. You win the lottery, right? If you win the lottery, so that's income. You have to give Meiser off of that. That's after the government takes away most of it, right? But you still, whatever you're left with, you have to give Meiser. And dividends on stocks, right? You also have to give Meiser on that. In other words, any kind of profits that a person makes, he has to give Meiser on that. If a stock is sold, let's say you own stocks, right? The stock goes up in value. The stock market has been very, very successful this past year. The stocks go up in value. You don't have to give Meiser right away until you sell the stock. If the stock appreciates in value, and let's say you bought it for $10 a share, and now it's worth $20 a share when you sell it. And so the profit that you're making when you're selling it, at that point of time, you have to give Ma'isa what's called the realized gain. That's the realized gain. There is an inflation factor, right? Sometimes the gain, the profit that you're making is not really so much profit because of inflation. For instance, if a person bought a house at a certain value at a certain cost and he's selling it and he's making a profit on it, that's not necessarily a real profit, because if he sold it 20 years later, since there was inflation, right, so then the value that he's making, the profit that he's making, is really not the face value of that profit. So the poskim say that one can incorporate the inflation value and deduct from the profit because of inflation. Inheritance. If one inherits money, even though you didn't work for it, you have to give Ma'isa on that. If one inherits a bank account that has $100,000 in it, you have to give Ma'isa from that bank account. Even if the father himself, the father who left over this bank account, already was mafrish Ma'isa, already separated Ma'isa. But now this is a new income for you, and therefore the son would have to give Ma'isa. Gifts. What about gifts? Right? That's always a very big question. You have to give Ma'isa on gifts. So the poskim say, if it's a monetary gift, a gift of money, yes, definitely. Wedding gifts, money gifts, whether it's checks or cash, one would have to give Ma'aser on that. What happens if it's gifts of objects? Someone gave you a dining room set, right? Parents, in-laws, they gave a gift of a dining room set, a bedroom set, right? Which has value. Does one have to give Ma'aser on that? Not to take off a leg and give it away, right? You don't take off one of the legs of the table. No, would one have to evaluate the value, the market value of this gift, and then give a tenth of that market value on the dining room set, or any other gift, or whether it be a car, or it be a house. Does one have to give ma'isa on gifts? That's a machlokes among the poskim. Most poskim say that you don't have to give ma'isa on gifts of objects, only on monetary, on gifts of money, but not on gifts of objects, unless you're selling it. If you received a gift and then you sell it, so now you're getting money for it, so then you would have to give ma'isa on that gift, but not on the object itself. On the dining room set, you don't have to evaluate it and give ma'isa on that. There are some poskim who say that if you would have bought the dining room set on your own, and you would have spent money for it, and now you're benefiting from it because somebody gave you that as a gift. That's called mishtarshen. You're benefiting from that value, from that amount of money. It's as if they gave it to you, and then you use that money to buy the dining room set. So then there are some poskim who hold that you would have to give in a situation like that, which Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, in general, even on gifts of objects, you would have to give ma'aseh. You would have to give ma'aseh on the value of that dining room set, but only if this is a dining room set that's very, very expensive. It's $30,000, and you would have bought a dining room set which is only worth $10,000, so you only have to give ma'aseh on the $10,000, because that's the benefit that you're having. You're not interested in such an expensive dining room. That's what Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's psak on this. However, minor ka'olam, the common custom is that we don't give ma'aseh on objects, only on gifts of money. But what happens if it is a gift of money? Your parents or your in-laws give you a gift of money, and just to help out. So then, you have to give ma'aseh on that. Where they want to give gifts because they want to express their love by giving this gift. If it's a gift of money, so you're supposed to give ma'aseh on that. What happens if they stipulate that this gift should be used only in a certain way? They're giving you money for a down payment on a house, and that's all. They don't want you to use the money to buy food or to buy a car, only for a down payment on the house. And that was their stipulation. So many poskim say, they give you a gift of money to make a chasana, to make a wedding, and it's stipulated only for that purpose, not to use it for any other purpose, or a gift to use for tuition for the children, right? So if they stipulate it to be used only for a specific purpose, so then the most poskim say that under those circumstances you do not have to give ma'aseh on that money. The money is, you're sort of like their shliach, you're their agent, right? You're their agent. They're giving it, just use it for the down payment on the house. We don't want to go through the trouble of buying the house and dealing with the real estate broker, but so you're in a certain sense our agent to give this as the down payment on the house. It's not your money for any other purpose, and you're not allowed to use it for any other purpose if they stipulate that you should use it only for this particular purpose. So most poskim say in a case like that, one would not have to give ma'aseh on that money that was stipulated for a specific purpose. But if they give you a gift that you can use the money for whatever you want, so then you would have to give ma'aseh on that. Of course, if you're capable, if you have your own parnosa, as we defined before, that you're capable of having your own sustenance, and but this is sort of something extra. But if this is just really to pay the food bills and the rent bills, then a person would be potter from giving ma'aseh. What happens with employee benefits? Person works, he's an employee in a company, such as medical insurance. So does one have to give ma'aseh on the medical insurance? So medical insurance, in many situations, there's a deduction from one's wages that's paid for the insurance, and then there's also an employer contribution, that the employer makes a contribution that's over and above the wages that one receives. So the deduction from one's wages, the poskim say, that even though you never saw that money, but that's because they're just doing you a favor. They're taking it off and paying it from your wages to the insurance company, and that is like profit. That's part of your income, right? And one should really give ma'aseh on that part, because it's no different than if you would receive that money and then use it for medical insurance. So once that's your income, so you have to give ma'aseh on that. The employer contribution, you have to give ma'aseh on the employer contribution. That's a major machlokus among the poskim. Do we say that it's as if the employer is giving you extra money, right? He's giving you extra money, but you're not seeing that money. He's not giving it to you. He's paying it directly to the insurance company. So the Rishon Zalman Auerbach held that you do have to give ma'aser on that, the employer contribution, because mishtarshe, you're benefiting from that. It's like extra money that you're earning, and because you would have to buy medical insurance anyway, right? Everybody has medical insurance today.
So could that be explained? What is that? Employer
Contribution. In other words, the employer gives a certain amount. Let's say the insurance is $500 a month. The premium is $500 a month. And they'll take out of your wages, they'll take out, let's say, $200. And the employer will give $300 to pay the premium. So that's like extra money that they're giving you, right? Because you need the medical insurance. So Rishon Zalman Auerbach held that one would have to give ma'aser on that. It's like money, that's like income. It's like income, and you're using the income for that purpose of medical insurance. However, many poskim disagree. Reb Nissen Korelitz and other poskim disagree, and they say that you never saw that money. That money was never given to you at all. It was, you have benefit from it, but since you never had that money, it's sort of indirect income that a person would not be chayiv to give ma'aser on that. I think that's the common minhag. That's the common practice, that certainly on the employer contribution to the medical insurance, right, that you don't have to give ma'aser. If each month he gives, let's say, $300 for the premium, you wouldn't have to take off $30 from your own income and give it to ma'aser. But it is a machlokes between the poskim on that.
So these people are focused only on the contribution, but not the deduction.
What?
These poskim are focused only on contribution, not deduction. What if it's deducted from the wages?
Deducted from the wages. I haven't seen anybody who disagrees that
What's the
you do
difference?
have to. You
What's
do.
the difference?
Because over there, that was your income. It's really, they should have paid it to you, and you should have sent it into the insurance company. They're just doing you a favor. Rather than pay it, it's much easier. It's like direct deposit into a bank, right? It just makes it easier for you. Over here, this is the employer is giving you something extra. It's not part of your income. He's just giving something extra, more than one's wages, but you don't see that. You never, that's indirect, it's called indirect income. And so many poskim say that you're not obligated to give ma'aser on that. It can get very, very complicated, the halachas of ma'aser. Let's talk about, that's the income. That's how you figure out the income. But when you figure out the net income, it's not the gross income, it's the net income. So there are going to be adjustments or deductions, because ma'aser is given on net income. Ma'aser is given on net income, and therefore certain things, that business expenses that a person has in order to run the business, so then that's considered to be, that is going to be deducted from the income in order to calculate the net income or the net profit that a person has. And this you'll see on the ma'aser form, all the various possibilities. I'm going to mention them in terms of, let's say a person has a business and he wants to calculate how much ma'aser he has to give, right? So he knows the income that he's getting, but there's a lot of overhead. There's much overhead. There's the wages he has to pay, utilities, the machinery, rent that he has to pay, the telephone bill, mail, travel for business, insurance for the business. All of these are part of the overhead in a business, and those are calculated in terms of determining the net income. What happens if he has business losses? He has profit, let's say he has a few businesses. And one business he makes a profit, and other business he has losses, right? So how do you calculate? So there is a Shvus Yaakov who says that you cannot deduct the business losses from the profits. You cannot deduct. We don't pass in that way. We pass in that the business losses during that period of time, and this is why the period, accounting period for mice is so important. Let's say it's from January to December. So all profits or income that you make, but all losses that you have, all business losses that you have to be taken into consideration into the calculation of the net income. Person has losses, he has gains on certain stocks that he has, and he has losses on other stocks, right? So when he sells those stocks, right, the stocks that he has the gains and the stocks he has the losses, so he has to calculate the net income, the net profit that he's making during that period of the Meiser accounting period. The poskim say that if one is going out to work and they need a housekeeper or a babysitter to allow them to go to work, let's say the wife is going to work, so she has to hire daycare, she has to hire a babysitter so that she can go to work. So that's considered to be a business expense, even though it's not directly related to the business or to the job. But in order for her to have that job, she has to hire somebody, pay. That's considered to be like a business expense or the Ozeret Bayit. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says if one has to take certain classes, professional courses, continuing education courses for his job, so that's also a business expense. Whatever one needs in order to continue the job, to enhance the job, so then that's considered to be an expense. It's a business expense, and one can deduct it. One of the big questions everybody wants to know is what about taxes, right? How does taxes fit in to calculating my Kesafim? So Ramosha Feinstein has a tshuva about this. Ramosha Feinstein writes that income tax is deducted from income. In other words, your net income is after taxes. It's after income tax, and you only have to give meiser on the net income. And the reason for that is, he says, is very, very simple. Income tax is a tax on your income. It's like you never earned that money, because the government is going to take it away. So even whether it's siphoned off immediately, right, that they send it in to the IRS immediately, or you have to write out a check to the IRS, that is income that was never earned. That's not part of the calculation of income. And so that's very, very clear. Ramosha Paskin that way. However, what about other taxes? What about real estate taxes? A person owns a home, you have to pay real estate taxes twice a year. What about sales tax? Right? Then can you deduct that? That could add up to a nice amount over the year. So Ramosha says real estate taxes, that's a personal obligation. You want to own a home, so that part of your expenses are to pay real estate taxes, just like you have to pay utilities and you have to pay for telephone, for heat, for water, for power. That's part of a person's obligation in living. So that cannot be deducted from Meiser. So real estate taxes cannot be deducted from the income. Sales tax also cannot be deducted from one's income. If a person has commercial real estate, in other words, the real estate is for his income, right? That's his business, right? That he buys real estate and he sells real estate and he has to pay real estate taxes. His business is real estate. So then the real estate tax is part of a business expense. That can be deducted. But a personal home that one has and you have to pay real estate taxes, you cannot deduct. Social Security, Ramosha says, is like income tax, right? That's like something you never got now. Eventually, when a person retires and they'll get Social Security from the government, right? At that time, that's they will have to give Meiser from that Social Security fund if they're capable of doing it at that time. But the Social Security now, that's siphoned off of a person's wages, you do not have to give Meiser on that. If one gets a tax refund, right? If you get a tax refund, so then you would have to give meiser on that tax refund. That's sort of like a gift from the government, and you have to give on that monetary gift. Very big question also that people ask is, in terms of deductions, can a person deduct household expenses before giving meiser? Right? There are many expenses that we have, right? In terms of a household, food, clothing, for the children, tuition, right? Household expenses. Well, the truth is, after you finish paying your household expenses, you're left with nothing. Right? You're left with nothing. But there is one posek who says, the Knesset Haggadolah, who says that you can first deduct hotzos habayis, the household expenses, the necessary household expenses, before calculating meiser, right? Meaning you can deduct the food, the rent, the clothing, and before calculating whatever you're left over with after that, on that you have to calculate meiser, because that's considered to be pure profit, and the household expenses are not considered to be a profit. But that would leave us with most people with hardly anything to give meiser on. The poskim disagree with that sheet, and I want to make that very clear. The halacha is that one cannot deduct household expenses before. We make an income, we make profit, and then what do we do with it? We have expenses. That's why we're making the money, because we have expenses. We have to pay rent, we have to pay mortgage, you have to pay clothing, you have to pay for food. That's part of living. But the meiser Kesafim is on whatever income we've made, and then, but without first deducting the household expenses, and that's the consensus of opinion of the poskim, Aruch HaShulchan, Chafetz Chaim, the Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the Minchas Yitzchok, that you cannot deduct household expenses before calculating meiser. And that's all of this you can see. You'll see on the meiser form. I want to talk a little bit about expenses for children, right? For child support. The din is that below the age of 6, a parent is obligated, according to halacha, to support the child. In the time of Chazal, after 6, they could tell the child, go out and get a job. In the time of Chazal, they were much more mature in those days, right? Over here, maybe at the age of 60, you can tell them, go out and get a job. But in those days, the child support was obligatory according to halacha until the age of 6. After the age of 6, parents, of course, would support the children, but that the Gemara calls tzedka. It was tzedka. Oset tzedka b'choles. That supporting a child over the age of 6 is tzedka. Ramesha Feinstein says that's not true today anymore. Today, there's an obligation on parents to support their children up until the age, as long as they're sort of living with the parents, when they're not independent. They're not moving out and getting their own job and getting married, right? So very often that's until the age 22, 23, 24, right? Until they sort of get married and start their own household, their own family. So so Ramesha says that has changed today. That's a sociological thing. In the time of Chazal, apparently after the age of 6, the children were able to be more on their own. They were much more mature, and the society was very, very different in those days. But Ramesha says today, the derech is that children live at home and are supported by their parents until a certain age, their 20s, their early 20s usually, and therefore there's an obligation to support the children until that time. Since there is an obligation to support the children until that time, as we'll see, one cannot use meiser. Whatever obligations, monetary obligations you have, you cannot use meiser for that, to fulfill that monetary obligation. But however, as we'll see, after the children get married, and they've left the house. Now there's no longer an obligation on certain parents to support. Parents will do it, they will help out, right, if they're capable of doing it, but they're not obligated according to halacha. And therefore, if the children, the married children, need some kind of help from the parents, so for the family, for whatever their needs are, especially if they're, let's say, the son is continuing to learn in Kollel and he needs the parents to help out, they can use Maisa to help out, and that's really one of the priorities that we'll see in terms of using Maisa. But under all circumstances, if the children need parental help, parental financial help, so then after they're married and they're living on their own independently, so then at that point of time, the parents could use Maisa money to help them out, and that's one of the priorities, in terms of using Maisa money to help out relatives. That's a priority, right? Krovim, to help out krovim. We'll talk about that shortly. Okay. So we figured out how to calculate Maisa. The income, what's income, what are the adjustments to income, and now you calculate a certain amount of Maisa. So let's say a person has to give $10,000 Maisa during that year, right? That's it. So disperse the Maisa, right? What can you use Maisa for? What can you give it to? Can you just use it for anything?
Tuition.
What?
Tuition.
I'll get to that. Yeah, that's part of this. Yeah. I know everyone wants that. That's the big question. I just want to do it in order. I could have started off with tuition and everyone would leave. So I have to hold on towards the end. And it's also very important to see it in context, to understand it. You can only understand if you have the background, you have the bigger picture, right? Not just a psak on one particular issue. So in terms of dispersing, giving out Maisa money, there are three basic principles how to give out Maisa and where to give Maisa. The first principle is that the Ikor Maisa is for poor people. That's the primary purpose of giving Maisa for poor people. Can you use Maisa money for other mitzvahs besides giving to poor people? That we call tzedka, right? Charity to poor people. That's the primary purpose. But can you use it to support a shul, to support a mikveh, for an eruv in the city, for certain renovations in the shul, for certain institutions that are doing kiruv, right? And they're doing kiruv. So, can you use Maisa for other mitzvahs, in other words, not just for supporting poor people? That is a machlokes between the poskim. The Maharil held that you can only use Maisa for poor people. Right? Maisa is designated to support poor people aniyim. The Shach and Taz bring a Marshal and Maram who disagree, and they say that you can use Maisa for other mitzvahs as well. If you're not capable of helping out the shul, supporting the shul or the mikveh with other monies, you have to use Maisa, right? So you can use Maisa for other mitzvahs as well. And that's in general the way we paskin, that Maisa can be used for other mitzvahs, not only for poor people. However, the Chafetz Chaim writes that the primary purpose of Maisa is for poor people, and one should give the most substantial amount of Maisa poor people, like Tomchei Shabbos, right? Helping poor people. The Chafetz Chaim writes that, and he also writes Hachzokas HaTorah, supporting Torah institutions, supporting Torah learning, whether it be in yeshivas or be in kollelim, is one of the primary purposes of Maisa. Notice the Chafetz Chaim writes there are two primary purposes in Maisa, right? Aniyim, poor people, and supporting Torah, supporting limud haTorah. Other mitzvahs, like a shul, like a mikvah, like an eruv, right? Those are secondary. So in terms of the proportions that a person gives of his Maisa, he has to take that into consideration. What's primary and what is secondary.
Personal mitzvot.
What?
Personal mitzvot.
Well, personal, yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. Like buying talis and tefillin, and yeah, we'll get to that in a moment.
Rabbi, you said that the mitzvah is... Sorry, I forgot my question.
What's that?
I forgot the question, sorry.
Okay, so you remember afterwards.
You said the Chofetz Chaim says that the Ikar is
Poor people and Hachzokas HaTorah,
Where does he
supporting
get that?
Torah. What?
what's his source?
Oh, he has sources.
I know, but
Chofetz
if
Chaim
it's
wrote-
come from the Torah, what's the source?
What? Oh, he has in Havetz Chesed. In his country is Havetz Chesed. He brings a source for that.
Can you give that to us? Or?
Well, I'll give it to you afterwards. I don't have the source right.
Because
now.
Maasera from the Torah is mainly for the Aniyim, no?
Oh, yeah. So that's a good point you're raising. This question of whether Meiser is mainly for Aniyim or can be used for other mitzvahs might really depend on the source of Meiser Kesafim. We mentioned before 3 possible sources of Meiser Kesafim. If it's learned from Meiser Ani, so then maybe it's exclusively for poor people. If, however, it's learned from Meiser Sheni Aser Ta'aser, it's called Meiser called Teruah Zarecha, or from Yaakov Avinu, so then it can be used for other mitzvahs as well. So it might depend on what the original source of Meiser is. But we paskin lahalocha that you can use Meiser for other mitzvahs as well, but the primary purpose of Meiser should be for aniyim, for poor people, and for supporting Torah
But
learning.
if you have the primary reason for the poor people and there are many poor people, then there's not going to be, if the primary
No, you
is
have
that,
to divide it. No, you have to divide.
Why
You don't
do
give
you have to-
everything.
Why not?
What?
If my primary obligation is to give it to poor people and there are people,
Because that's what the poskim say. The
Well, I
poskim
mean,
say you
if
don't
there
give
are-
everything. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
but
We'll see how to divide it. We'll see. There are ways of dividing. There are many different things that are pulling at us, right? Local institutions in Eretz Yisrael, right? All different kinds of. So there has to be some way, some method of how you divide it.
But if as Chofetz Chaim says, one of those 6 things is pikuach nefesh, if there are people starving from food, if there are poor people, shouldn't I put all my eggs in one basket? Because that's the
No.
primary.
Even then you don't. If there's a particular person who is going to die unless you give, right? And it comes to you, then of course you have to give. You have to give more than a fifth. But otherwise, you're making a division. You're deciding how to make the division. So you have to make the division proportionally, but not everything. Let's wait on that.
Wait for the
Let's
questions
wait.
at the end.
Let's wait. Let's
go
wait
for
on
the-
that. A second principle in terms of giving meiser is that one cannot use meiser for a dover shebechova. If you have a prior monetary obligation, you cannot pay up that obligation with meiser. Very, very important principle. If you have a monetary obligation, you cannot pay up that obligation with meiser. So, for instance, a person has an obligation to buy tefillin. You can't use meiser to buy tefillin. You can't use meiser to buy a lulav and esrog, right? Because that's an obligation that one has. Matonos lavyonim on Purim, an obligation to give matonos to poor people on Purim. You can't use meiser for that. Machzis hashekel, kaparis, right? These are minhagim which have become obligations. You cannot use meiser money for that. However, in terms of matonos lavyonim, right? You can use meiser once you fulfill the basic obligation, right? Matonos lavyonim is to give to two poor people, right? And you want to give to many more poor people on Purim. So once you've given to 2 poor people, the minimum that you have to give, anything over and above that is no longer obligatory. And therefore you could use meiser money for that. The person,
You said the obligation to buy
hold-
There's no obligation to buy tefillin though. You said
there is an obligation,
To
because
buy
everyone
tefillin.
has their own tefillin, even though you could use somebody else's.
He's saying there's an obligation to buy tefillin.
Yes, there is an obligation, yes. The Taz says, let's say a person gets an aliyah and he makes a mishaberach, right? And he makes a neder, right? He makes a neder to give a donation, right? And afterwards he thinks, maybe I should use meiser to fulfill that donation. You can't, because once you made a neder to give that donation, it's an obligation. It's a neder. Now you can't fulfill that obligation with Maisa. However, if at the time when you're making the neder, when you're making the Misha Berach, you think, I want to use Maisa for that, that's okay. But after the fact, after you made the neder, and now you want to fulfill the obligation with Maisa, one cannot do that because you cannot use Maisa to fulfill a monetary obligation. Therefore, tuition. Now we come to tuition. Ramesha Feinstein, well, it really started before Ramesha. The Orech HaShulchan and the Chavetz Chaim both write. There's an obligation on parents to pay tuition for their children to teach them Torah, to send them to yeshiva. It's an obligation. It's a monetary obligation, and therefore one cannot use Maisa money to pay tuition because it's an obligation that parents have. What about for girls, chinuch, girls' education? There's a chiyuv on a father to teach his son Torah. There's no chiyuv on a father to teach his daughter Torah, right? There's no mitzvah Talmud Torah on the daughter. So some poskim say, Rav Elyashiv says, that you could use Maisa for girls' education because there's no obligation. Other poskim, however, Rav Moshe says, no, today in America, it is an obligation. It's an obligation to send one's daughter to a yeshiva, to a Beis Yaakov. Why? Because since in America there's an obligation of education through 12th grade, right? That's the law. You have to send your children to public school through 12th grade. So if you won't send the daughter to yeshiva, you'll be obligated to send her to public school. Can't send your daughter to public school, right? You have to. There's an obligation on the parent to raise her as a Bas Yisrael, with the values of Torah and mitzvahs and amunah, and she's certainly not going to get that in public school, and the negative influences will be terrible. So Ramesha says, Mimela, automatically, right? Because in America there's an obligation on a parent to educate their child in public school, and you can't do that. You have to send to yeshiva, so that's obligatory. It's an obligation to send the daughter to yeshiva, to Beis Yaakov, and therefore the tuition is obligatory, so one cannot use Maisa for tuition for a daughter, just as they cannot use Maisa for tuition for a son. However, there are certain qualifications on this, right? And that's what everyone wants to hear. The qualifications on this. One qualification, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, let's say the one could figure out the actual cost of educating every child in the school. Let's say full tuition is $25,000, right? But the actual cost of educating each child, if they would be able to figure that out, would be only $15,000. Now that means that people who are paying full tuition are paying more than is really necessary for the actual cost of the education. They're paying an extra $10,000. Where's that extra $10,000 going? It's going to people who are not capable, who want scholarship, right? They're not capable of paying tuition. So you are really supporting, by your paying full tuition, you're really supporting others. And therefore, Rosh Zalman Auerbach said, under those circumstances, one could use for that extra $10,000, if you'd be able to figure out, it's not so easy, but if one would be able to figure out the actual cost of the education, whatever you're paying over and above that is going for others, and therefore that could come from Maisa. Ramesha, that's number one. Number two, qualification number two. Ramesha said, if the school assesses for tuition more than this person is capable of paying. In other words, if the school is really not nice, and they're making somebody pay a full tuition, right, $25,000 when their whole income is $75,000, right? It's a rare situation. Just want to give an extreme example, right? That's over and above. That's not reasonable. That's not right. So then one could include in part of their tuition, one could include Maisa Kesafim. Another exclusion, possible exclusion, is that is post high school. Post high school. So if a son or a daughter is going to, not a daughter, but if a son is going to yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael after they graduate high school, right? So basically, the father has pretty much fulfilled his obligation, and the obligation to teach the child basic chumash, right, and possibly develop the skills in learning Gemara, in learning Mishnah and Gemara. Now, post-high school, which is very, very important that a son should go to yeshiva, whether in Eretz Yisrael or yeshiva in America, and learn for a few years, but that's not the obligation on the father to pay for that. So the father can use Maisa money to pay for that, but not room and board. Room and board he'd have to pay anyway if the son were not, or if the son were home. But for the education itself, going to the yeshiva, going to the Beis Medrash, for that tuition will be mutter to use Maisa for that. And then one other qualification is if one wants to hire a tutor for their child, right? One hires a tutor to their child to learn extra things, right? For enhancement. You're allowed to use Maisa money for that. Let's say if the child has difficulty in class, he's not able to catch on to the Gemara that he's learning, so he needs a tutor to help him keep up. So that's the obligation of the father to make sure that the child is developing the skills and is learning and he's developing those skills. So that's part of it. If the tuition in the school is not working, because it's just not working in the class, you have to hire an extra tutor outside of class, then you cannot use Maisa. If, however, for enhancement, he wants the child to learn Mishnayos, to finish Sidrei Mishnah, right? To do something extra, that you can use Maisa. You can use Maisa money for that. Okay, so the principle is if it's an obligation, a monetary obligation, you cannot use Maisa money. Third principle is personal benefit. One cannot have personal benefit from Maisa money. So, for instance, shul membership, right? To pay shul membership, one is not allowed to use that for Maisa money, use Maisa money for that, because you're getting certain benefits. I assume there are certain benefits from shul membership. You can use the social hall for a kiddush without paying for it, and you get a seat in the shul for Yomim Noroim or for every Shabbos. So there are certain personal benefits that one is getting. You cannot use Maisa money for that personal benefit. If one is buying a seat for Yomim Noroim, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you cannot use Maisa money for that because that's a benefit that you're getting. You're able to daven in the shul, you're able to have a seat, you don't have to stand the whole day. So one cannot use Maisa money for that. Of course, it depends what the cost of the seat. Sometimes they have a different scales in terms of the seat, and if the shul is willing to allow somebody to pay, instead of paying $600, they only have to pay $200. So then the $200 is for the personal benefit of the seat, and anything over and above that you're giving is a donation to the shul. So that you'll be able to use Maisa money for that. The dinners, going to a dinner for a yeshiva, a dinner for a kollel, right? Can use Maisa money for the dinner. Let's say it's $250 per person, right? Can you use Maisa money for that? So the poskim, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and others say that you're allowed to use Maisa money anything which is over and above the benefit that you're getting from the dinner. I don't mean the speeches, but the benefit that you're getting from the dinner. In other words, the meal, right? The meal has a certain cost, right? If let's say they're serving rib steak, and the cost is they're serving prime ribs, and the cost is let's say $50 for the plate or $75. So up until that amount, the benefit that you're getting, the personal benefit of the food, that you can't use Maisa for. Anything over and above that is purely tzedakah, it's charity to help the institution, that you can use Maisa. When I go to a dinner, a kollel dinner, a yeshiva dinner, so I take two checkbooks along. I take my regular checkbook and my tzedakah checkbook. and from the regular checkbook, I'll find out what is the actual benefit, the personal benefit that I have. In other words, what's the cost of the meal, the cost that they have of the meal. Others say it doesn't even have to be the cost of the meal. It could be if you would go out to a restaurant and get that meal, so the caterer is going to charge, let's say, $75. Or you go to a restaurant, it'll cost you $35, that's your benefit, $35. Right? What?
No question.
Or at home. Some say even at home what you would eat dinner at home, right? And so you have a steak at home. It's only going to cost you $12, right? So it's only going but whatever is over and above that personal benefit, so then you can write that check from your Meiser account. Let me just talk about a few other things. Few more points. There really is a lot more on this, but maybe I'll go through the questions that were sent in, and then maybe I'll take a few questions. Okay, can you use Meiser money to buy Svarim? Right, to buy Svarim, to buy a Shas, to buy a Shulchan Aruch. Can one use Meiser money for that? Well, the Shach and the Taz write yes, because that's also, it's a tzorech litzvah, especially if you're going to lend them out for other people. So they write that you can use Meiser money. It's not an obligation like tefillin or like arba minim, right? But people do buy. People want to have svarim in their house, and so the Shach and the Taz say yes. That's called Eisei Tzedaka B'chol Eis. Reb Chaim Kanevsky and Rav Elyashiv say that today the situation has changed. The situation has changed. In the time of the Middle Ages, certainly in the time of Chazal, Svarim were very rare to be had. And anyone who had a sefer would lend it out to others. So he was doing a mitzvah with it, to lend the sefer to other people that they could learn from it. Today, that's not really done. Today, the Svarim are so accessible, are so available, that people have their own Svarim, or they use the Svarim of the Beis Medrash, right? And they don't really lend it out. Once in a while you lend out a sefer to somebody, but that's not a primary purpose in buying the Svarim. And therefore, they say that today one should not use Meiser Kesafim to buy Svarim. What about using Meiser Kesafim so we said that you can use Meiser, the primary purpose should be for Aniyim, for poor people, like Tomchei Shabbos and so on, or for Limud HaTorah, right? Hachzokes HaTorah, supporting Talmidei Chachomim, supporting yeshivas and kollelim, and one can also use Meiser for a shul, for a mikvah, for an eruv, right? And but what about giving tzedakah, using Meiser to give to the American Cancer Society, to give to secular non-Jewish charities? Can one use some of the Meiser? Certainly that should not be a primary amount of Meiser, but can one use some Meiser to send into the American Cancer Society? So Ramesha Feinstein writes, you can. You can, even though it's not Jewish, but to send in for cancer research. First of all, for two reasons, and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach also says this, for two reasons. First of all, the halacha is mefarnesim aniyei akum ve'imaniyei Yisrael. You're allowed to give tzedakah to non-Jews, right? And that's for Darkei Shalom. It's to promote good relations, and so one can give. Of course, that should not be the primary. It should be you give some tzedakah to non-Jews, so you can give some Meiser. And Rosh Zalman Auerbach said a second reason, but Jews are also benefiting from that. They're benefiting from cancer research, or research, any institute which is doing research for various diseases, right? The Jews are going to benefit from that. So therefore, one is allowed to give some money, some tzedakah for Meiser Kesafim, for cancer research, or for some other non-Jewish charities. Let me just mention one other thing two other things. Buying a raffle ticket. Can one use Meiser money to buy a raffle ticket? Right? A raffle ticket for an institution. They're having a raffle, right? Chinese auction, or a raffle that they're having for a yeshiva. So there happens to be a very interesting machlokes among the poskim about this. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rabbi Yashi said, no, you can't use Maisa money for a raffle ticket. Why? Because there's a potential personal benefit. You're buying the raffle ticket so that you could possibly win, and even if you don't win the raffle, right, still you're buying it. It's like you're buying an object that could give you a potential benefit. So you have a personal benefit. Can't use Maisa, as we said before, for personal benefit. Ramosha Feinstein has a tshuva in which he makes a distinction between two different types of raffles. There are raffles that they sell an unlimited amount of tickets, and then there's raffles that they sell a limited amount, right? Let's say they'll sell certain raffles only 5,000 tickets, no more. And then there are raffles that they'll sell as many as they can. So Ramosha Feinstein says, it depends. If it's a limited amount, 5,000 tickets, you can figure out the market value of each and every ticket based on the chances of a person winning. If there are only 5,000 tickets sold, right, so they have a greater chance than if they're going to sell 25,000 tickets, right? So in that case, the ticket has a market value. It has a market value. You're buying something that has a market value. You cannot use Maisa for that. However, if it's an unlimited amount and we have no idea how many tickets they're selling, right? So then there is no market value on that ticket. And Moshe held, in a situation like that, you can use Meiser to buy that raffle ticket. If you win, right? If you lose, fine. If you win, so then Ramosha says that you should return the value. So to the value to your Meiser account, and also whatever you win, you have to give Meiser on that. Whatever you win, you have to give Meiser. You give Meiser to any institution that you want. But you would then, if you do win, then you would have to return the value. Let's say the raffle ticket was $100. Return $100 to the Meiser account, right, from other money that you have. Now, just a little bit in terms of priorities in giving Meiser, right? This is one of the most difficult aspects of Meiser. How does one decide what to give to and how much to give to each of these, whether it be individuals or institutions? So there are a number of different principles that are operative over here, and one has to sort of try to merge and mesh these various principles. Shulchan Aruch says that krovim aniyim take precedence. If you have relatives who are poor, they take precedence over anyone else, especially if it's parents. If the parents are poor and they need help, they take precedence over any other relatives. And if a person is capable of supporting the parents, not using Maisa money, that's preferred. But if the only way to support the parents is to use Maisa money, so then you can use the Maisa money. You should use the Maisa money, even if it's necessary to use almost all of your Maisa money for the parents. They take precedence. They're the closest relatives that one has, Hakaras HaTov that you have to show to them. So they take precedence. And then, when it comes to other relatives, it depends on how close the relative is. The closer the relative, the greater the obligation. Just like in terms of giving out to other poor people. The poor people of your city take precedence over the poor people of any other city. Aniya ircha kodmim, to another city. So if it's a matter of you only have enough funds to give to poor people of Los Angeles, and you have poor people from New York coming, or even poor people from Eretz Yisrael coming, right? So then, Aniyah Ircha take precedence. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't give to poor people who are coming from Eretz Yisrael. We have to. But just in terms of the proportions, how much one is giving, right? One should give more of their Meiser to Aniyah Ircha, the local poor people, rather than to poor people from outside the city. Aniyah Eretz Yisrael, poor people from Eretz Yisrael, take precedence over poor people from Brooklyn, because that's the halacha that Eretz Yisrael takes precedence. But the Aniyah Ercha takes precedence. This is the consensus of the poskim over everyone else, even the Aniyim from Eretz Yisrael. The just one more point before I get to the questions. So how does one know how to divide their ma'aser in terms of relatives, in terms of the poor people of the city? What percentage do you give? Because you can't just give only to your own, right? Only to the people of the city, and say to the aniyim who are coming, the poor people from Eretz Yisrael, I'm giving all of my tzedakah to Los Angeles and nothing to you. You can't do that. It has to be divided. But how do you divide it? What are the percentages? So the Chachmas Adam gives us some kind of guideline, and he says that in terms of relatives, poor relatives rather than poor non-relatives, he says you can give up to half or possibly up to 2/3 to your poor relatives, but you have to save and some money and give to other people as well. First of all, you have to give to other people. Maybe they don't have family that could give to them, right? So you have an obligation to help them out. Secondly, it'll be a chilul Hashem. It's a chilul Hashem. If a person's only reserving all of his ma'aser funds just for his relatives or just for the people in the city, he's demonstrating, I don't care about anybody else. I only care about my own. They have priority. They have priority. They do take precedence, but that doesn't mean that you don't care about anybody else, right? A Jew has to care about all of Klal Yisrael, about all Jews. We're all one big body. We're all one unit, right? And you have to. And when the right hand, it's like when the right hand suffers, the left hand feels the pain as well, right? So you have to feel the pain of all Jews. But there have to be certain priorities, and Halacha, the Chachmas Adam, gives us the guidelines in terms of your relatives, right? Up to 1/2, leave the other half for other poor people, right? And the same thing, Rav Heinemann years ago used this guideline that the Chachmas Adam gives in terms of relatives and non-relatives, in terms of city, the poor people of your city. Right, rather than poor people from outside the city. He said the same thing, that when it comes, I'm not giving you exactly his guidelines, a little bit complicated, but basically half of your tzedakah should go to the poor people in your city, right? And the other half, right, should go outside the city. And there are certain obligations, that a person has, moral obligations, in terms of the yeshiva that he learned in terms of certain people who did him favors in his lifetime. So then those also take priority, because you have a closer relationship and a greater moral obligation to help out in those situations. So let me go over to the questions that were sent in. All right, I'll try to answer these questions and then maybe take a few questions from the floor. Many of these questions we've answered already, so there might be one or two that we haven't answered. But this will be a good review to summarize some of the major issues that we've discussed. One, can tuition be deducted from ma'aser? Right? In other words, can you use ma'aser for tuition? Right? If you can't deduct tuition from the income, then the question I understand is, can you use ma'aser money to pay tuition? We discussed that Reb Moshe, that all the poskim say that you can, it's an obligation on the father to pay tuition for his son or his daughter, and therefore one cannot use ma'aser money in that situation. There might be certain exclusions that we mentioned, but the post-high school, when they're going to Eretz Yisrael, she's going to seminary, he's going to yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, so then you can use ma'aser money for tuition, right? But not what's included in
So how do you
the,
figure what's room and board and what's?
you have to try to figure it out. You have to speak to the yeshiva and ask them how much goes for room and board and how much goes for tuition. That's it.
What about registration and book fees and everything?
What?
Registration and book fees, other stuff. That's all part of tuition.
That's all part, that's all
It says
part.
$500 registration fee.
That's,
You cannot.
that's part of tuition.
Part
That's
of
tuition, yeah. They won't let you into the school if you don't pay the registration. See, they break it up. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing, yeah.
Building.
It's good, building fund, right, building fund.
Sure.
Right? Building fund in a school, right, so let's say they charge building fund and dinner, banquet, right? So they call it building fund, they call it banquet, but if you won't pay it, your child's not gonna get an entrance, they won't be able to enter, right? It's an obligation, whatever they call it, they can call it a building fund, but it's obligatory. They won't allow the child into the school unless you pay the building fund or if they say it's optional, which I don't think they say, but if they'll say it's optional, or in your case, we're not going to charge you the building fund or the banquet fee, so then it's not obligatory. But if it is obligatory and they won't allow the child to attend the school, so then that's a chova. You cannot use. I've looked around on this. I've asked around because this is a big question that everyone has about the building fund. I haven't been able to find anybody say that you can use Maisa for the building fund, just like you can't use Maisa for tuition. Now, if a person is simply not capable of paying the tuition, they're simply not capable, but they have to send their child to yeshiva. They have to consult with a Rav. They have to ask a shayla. Maybe under those circumstances, they could use their Maisa, part of their Maisa money for tuition. But in general, right, across the board, the halacha is, since tuition is an obligation, you cannot use Maisa money. A person is simply not capable of, they won't be able to send their child to yeshiva, that's an impossibility, that they shouldn't send their child to yeshiva. So then there might be some posting that one could rely on to use Maisa money under those circumstances. But one has to consult and ask a shayla. Yes?
Rabbi said that the most important is first for the kroven. So let's say that
I didn't hear?
Rabbi said that a person should first help the kroven of his family before he helps.
Right.
So let's say if a guy makes $100,000 a year and he has $10,000 meiser, and then the $10,000, if he splits it, is $5,000. That's not going to help his family much.
That's all he can do. That's all
So
he can do.
Is it a bigger Indian to pay $10,000 to the family? Or
No,
5,000
but-
and give another 5,000 to outside?
No. 10,000 is also not going to help them much. No, you give up to 5,000. The Chachas Adam has one opinion, 2/3. You give 2/3 to the family, especially if it's parents, But you have to leave over. You can't just give to your relative. Except in the case of parents. If the parents really need, right? If the parents really need all the Maisa money to help support them, in that situation you can give everything to them. But otherwise, if it's other relatives, it's cousins, it's third cousin once removed, you have to leave over a certain percentage to help others. Okay. Next, question 2. Yes.
Quick question, I might have missed this, but for secular studies, is your school loan debt an obligation?
What?
For secular studies, is your school loan debt an obligation, or can you use that as an expense? Deduct that as an expense?
No, because when you go into the school, the tuition is charged for everything, and you have to pay everything.
Isn't that a
Doesn't
business
matter.
expense?
Yeah, what do you mean secular studies? Yeshiva?
No, secular studies,
Oh,
university.
you mean university?
University.
Oh, no, that's, you can't use Maisa money for that.
They're not vice, you're saying
Can you
they're not.
deduct that as an expense?
You mean as an expense to learn a profession, for a job?
So,
Not
let's say
really, no, not really, because you don't,
And it
you
does-
you got a loan, $200,000 to go to school for 4 years, you come
Yeah.
out, you graduate, and then you're back in repayments. You can't deduct that as an expense?
you can't use Maisa to pay the,
A business expense.
a business expense, the loan that you took out to go to school, I don't think you can. I don't think you can. I have to look into that. It's only for, continue education. That you have to go to certain classes and take certain courses in order to continue in this profession. That you could use mice. That you can deduct as an expense. That you can deduct as an expense. I don't think that the student loan. What, is this a student loan for medical school or it's for college? For medical. If it's for medical school, possibly. Yeah, because that's specifically for a profession. Yeah, possibly. Stam for college. And college is not for your profession right now.
Prelude.
Well, it's a prelude. I think it's too far removed, but I have to look into it. I'm not 100% sure about that. Okay. Can a kollel banquet costs be deducted from meiser? So we just discussed that, right? 3. What do you do if you get salary from your own investment, and the rest of the profit goes into the investment, and business gets bigger, but salary stays the same? No, so the profit is going back into the investment. It's going back into the company, right? So you have to take off meiser, give meiser on that profit that's going back into the company.
Dividends.
What?
Dividends on stock
Right,
goes
dividends,
back and
yeah, it goes back and it goes back. So there's a machlokas poskim about that. There's some poskim, contemporary poskim. Some say that it's like you got it and you just put it back in, and therefore you have to take meiser. And other poskim say that you never really saw it. It's just becoming part of the. It's capital that is becoming part of the asset of the company. So until you sell it, or until you take out those profits, you would not be chayiv to take off meiser, to give meiser on that. 4. Can you spend your meiser for kibbud avayim, for example, buying them a ticket to go to Eretz Yisrael? Good question, right? To buy them a ticket to go to Eretz Yisrael. Now the halacha is in kibbud avayim that if they have the money themselves, you're not obligated to pay for their copy. If they have the money, it's mishalav, not mishal ben. If, however, they don't have the money, right? They don't have the money, and they need you to help them, so that becomes tzedakah. Then you're giving them tzedakah, and if you're capable of buying the ticket for them, not using meiser money, that's what you should do. But if you're not capable, then you could use meiser money. It's preferable not to use, if one is capable, it's preferable not to use the meiser money for the parents, because that's sort of like a disgrace to the parents. I'm using the meiser money for poor people, and I'm using that for the parent. But if you can't, if the only way that you can demonstrate your koved for them is by using meiser money, then you could use meiser money. If they don't have the money themselves, you want to give them a gift to go to Eretz Yisrael, right? You want to buy them tickets as a gift, right? Don't use meiser money for that, right? But if they want to go, and they don't have the funds, and you do, and you don't have the funds, unless you use meiser, then you could use
Just
meiser.
make sure don't let them know.
What?
Yeah.
Just make sure don't let them
Doesn't
know.
matter. It doesn't matter. It's still just in terms of your attitude towards them. I'm treating them like I would treat a poor person. If you have money and not, you shouldn't use the meiser, because then you'll have, it's a different attitude that you'll have.
Really?
4. Can you spend your
Can I ask a
5?
question about number 3, which you just said?
Yeah.
Can you clarify what you define as an obligation? Because it seems like it's a mitzvah but not an obligation. So
By what?
the example you just gave for the flight, what if it's your Rebbe? What if you have a mitzvah to respect your Rebbe and you want to buy him a flight to go somewhere? That seems like it's a mitzvah, it's not obligated.
You have no obligation to buy, to be mechabed your Rebbe the same as your parents.
So
You
what are
have
the
to-
gedorim is my question.
What?
What are the gedorim? It seems like it's
a whole different topic you're asking. But but your parents, you have an obligation of kibbud. What's the obligation of kibbud? Sustaining them, machil mashke, giving them food, taking them in and taking them out, driving them places, right? So part of kibbud would be if they would want to go to Eretz Yisrael, right? So then that's part of kibbud. By a Rebbe, you don't have that same type of obligation. It's then you're just giving him a gift. It's purely a gift that you're giving him. There's no such obligation.
Like the Cancer Society, you said. Why can you use that from us?
Why can you use? Because that's tzedakah. You're giving it to support. I mean, the Rebbe is poor, so then that's tzedakah you're giving to him.
What's considered tzedakah is that question? Because it's very vague. Because on the one hand you're saying Cancer Society is okay, then you're saying like your parents are not. So what's considered tzedakah?
And then when there's a need.
So if the Rebbe wants to go to a
No, wants to go is not necessarily a need. When there's a need, right? Wants to go, you want to do many things, but that's not a need.
He has a need to go visit his parents.
He has a need, and he can't afford it, and he can't afford. Possibly then that you could maybe under those circumstances, yes.
Like political expenses, for example.
What, political?
Yeah, you wanted like APAC or something,
No.
or something that's
Well, APAC.
something that benefits Jews politically.
Yeah.
So is that a need? It's very vague, this definition.
I think I've given enough examples of what
So the one is okay or not?
intuitively. So you're raising the fringe issues.
So I'm trying to find the Gedarim, but it's like...
The Gedarim are very hard unless you have to mention each and every specific case. The APAC, I guess, helping Israel. Yeah, helping Israel would be.
It's a non-profit, therefore it's
It's a tzorech. It's a tzorech.
Any non-profit is okay?
Yeah.
What?
It's a
He's
charitable.
saying non-profits. Do you
Yeah,
agree
it's
to
a
that?
charitable.
Any non-profit is okay. Is considered.
I don't think any non-profit
Not
is okay.
any.
Not any. No. Not any. No.
All right, next.
Yeah. Let's. Yes.
If a person has a car and a house and let's say some investment, but his income is hardly enough to pay for the expenses, should he sell an investment or he should sell his patur? I mean, even though the guy has an investment, is
Yeah.
it patur this year? And let's say next year he becomes very rich. Do we just forget about this year?
You don't have to sell off your house and move into a rental or to sell off your car. You don't have to do that, right? You don't have to do that. No.
So what if
Yeah.
he's rich next year? Can we say last year he was patur for everything?
Well, you
and
take
now-
year by year. Each year is
So you don't-
each
you
year is
don't go
separately. You
back.
go back. You don't go back.
You don't
No,
go back.
you don't go back. No.
I-
Year-
I-
year by year.
Another question, if the parents pay for the house, for the down payment of the house, let's say they pay $200,000, and then you sell the house in 2 years, you make some profit plus that down payment. Then how do you pay?
And how do you figure out the Maisa on that? I guess whatever the profit is that you're making, you didn't spend anything on that house, right? So that it's total, whatever income you're getting from the sale of that house is considered to be an income, and you would have to give Maisa on it.
Even on that down payment?
Even on the down payment part, you couldn't, because now, once it's like the parents have given you a gift, if they give you a gift of a house, right? And you sell that house, so whatever income you're making from that sale, that's income for you. And therefore, you would have to, right? You would
And
have
the
to-
gift also, right? You
What?
pay on the gift also.
If you would sell it, but not on the object of
If
it.
you sell it in 2 years,
What?
you still pay?
Yeah, should be. No difference. Okay, let me just finish these questions. What if you borrowed money from friends to buy a regular house? Do you have to give Maisa first or give your debts first? A very, very good question, right? A person has debts, right? Not to credit card companies, but he has debts to friends, to other Jews that he's borrowed money from. And there's an obligation to pay those debts, believe it or not. There's an obligation to pay up debts. And the Sefer Hasidim says that really one should pay off his debts before giving substantial amounts of tzedakah. That is primary. You have to pay off your debts to other Jews. Doesn't mean you don't give tzedakah. You give tzedakah. But if a person wants to just give out a lot of tzedakah, and neglect paying debts, Sefer Hasidim says that's not correct. You have to somehow try paying off the debts at the same time giving tzedakah, but then you're not giving as much tzedakah as you would want, right? Because you have an obligation to pay off the debts. And there's no, I don't have an exact percentage. So how much money do you use to pay off the debts, and how much money do you use to give to tzedakah? There's nothing exact, but you have to. The mindset has to be: I can't just keep on giving tzedakah and neglect paying my debts. I have to somehow combine the two.
Would you give under Maaser? Less than Maaser you should give?
What?
Or should you give your Maaser?
Yeah, less than Maaser. Then give less than Maaser. If you're not capable of paying off the debts, if you'll give Maaser. The debts don't have to be paid off overnight. They don't have to be paid off at one time. It could be over a period of time.
So your mortgage is also your debt.
What?
If you have mortgage, it also is your debt.
Mortgage? No, we're talking about debts to a Jew.
Only to
Because
Jews.
there's a mitzvah. That's a mitzvah. That's a mitzvah you have
You have
to pay.
obligation to pay your mortgage to the bank.
You have an obligation, yeah, but it's not the same level. Not the same level of obligation. You have an obligation because they'll foreclose, right? And number 6, what is your obligation? Distributing ma'aser to local institutions that you benefit from them, rather than mishulachim from Eretz Yisrael. So we mentioned that, right? Primary obligation is local, right? But you still have to give to mishulachim from Eretz Yisrael. By the way, in terms of mishulachim from Eretz Yisrael, there is a difference between 2 different types of mishulachim who come from Eretz Yisrael. There are people who are coming for personal needs, right? Medical expenses, making a wedding for their daughter or son, right? Right? And then there are people who are working for institutions, right? They're coming and they get a commission. That's their job. They're collecting for a yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. There's a greater obligation to people who are coming for their own personal needs. They're anim. They're true anim, right? The person who's coming for an institution is, right, it's a job for him. He's not an oni necessarily. He's getting a percentage of whatever he makes. So that doesn't have the same level of obligation. 7, are you obligated to give ma'aser if you don't make ends meet from this year's income, but you have $1 million of cash in your bank? Right? You have $1 million of cash in your bank. So why are you not meeting your ends if you have $1 million of cash in the bank?
Income.
But your
What?
income.
In your monthly income. I understand.
investment, but the income is not made.
Your expenses are 5,000, your income is 4,000 a
What?
month. Your expenses are 5,000 a month, your income is 4,000 a month.
Right, so why not use the $1 million that's in the bank account?
You're obligated to invest.
Well, the question is, are you obligated to? Are you up? So if a person, what? It's not an investment, this is in the bank account. This was in the bank, this is savings. This is savings, not an investment. So saving, it depends why you're saving it, I think, it depends. If you designated this money, let's say, to pay off the expense of a wedding, daughter's wedding, that's one thing. So then, you don't have to use that up because it was designated. If it's a stamp savings account, right? So you shouldn't, right? So a person should be using that, or at least investing it, rather than just keep it in the bank. That means you have money. You're not a poor person. You're capable of paying for all of your needs and all of your expenses. You just don't want to use that money.
Yeah,
Right?
this year he didn't have income.
But so take the money out of the bank.
At a certain point, they're gonna need to go to collect then too, if they
Yeah,
use
but
all the money in the bank.
until this point, until that point, you have $1 million. I mean, a billionaire who wants to keep the money in the bank doesn't have to give ma'aser because my salary, I only own a salary of $2,000 a month. No, that doesn't make sense. If you have the money, so then, unless it's a reasonable amount of money that's been designated for a specific purpose, that you are saving it to pay off a wedding, and you're not going to use it for anything else. I think so.
What about investment? If the money is investment, what should you do?
Investments, you don't have to sell your investments. You don't have to sell your car and get a jalopy. right? You don't have to sell the investment either, right? Once it's invested, it's like the investment, we view it as a shava kesef, it's something.
Okay, actually, a person could be a millionaire with a lot of investment, but he's not making enough money and doesn't pay myself. Therefore, that.
I think so, I think
What?
so.
It
Yeah.
could-
It's a question, yeah, I think so, I
Yes?
think so, yeah.
That's a master
Okay, let me just go through the last three questions and take a few more, and I have to meet my wife. And that's Shalom Bayis, that overrides everything. 8, what if you have a few investments, you have profit on some and losses on others, right? So how do you calculate the mice? We discussed that, right? Now, over the period of time, you add up the profits and deduct the losses for the net income. 9, can you deduct mortgage from your office, from your mice? So we mentioned before that overhead can be deducted from income in calculating the net income. So that's rent, but mortgage I assume is because you own it, right?
That's the point of the question. In other words, he could have rented, but he's
Right, but
buying.
he bought it, and therefore he has this asset, and he's paying the mortgage, so that he can keep the asset. Rabbi Yashiv said you cannot deduct that, because that's not like rental. Rental is like overhead, right? But the mortgage is, you wanted to buy it and have this asset and own it, so you have to pay, and you have to pay a mortgage on it, just like a house. You have to pay a mortgage on your house, so that cannot be deducted as an expense, as an overhead.
What about the tax on that?
What?
The
Tax?
yearly tax.
Real estate.
So that same office, if he pays yearly tax on it,
Yearly.
Property.
Property
real
tax.
estate tax.
Real estate tax.
On that
But
property.
that office is for his business,
Yeah.
right? It's business. So the real estate tax is a business expense thing. It's considered a business expense, and that you can deduct. But the mortgage itself, you want to maintain, you want to own this office. So that's not considered to be a business expense.
Right, they have a lot of loans these days that you can transfer your lease payments into just owning it for a very little down payment. So a lot of people, they say, okay, I put 10% down, and now I can own it. So then it's the same exact what you were paying as your lease rate. So to a lot of people, it's still the same expense, you're still making the same amount of money. So why is it that you're not able to deduct it from your income? Because at the end of the day, it's an expense. You don't have your tax return, everything, it's an expense.
You're getting equity.
Well, maybe, okay, or maybe the equity portion of your mortgage, okay, I hear that, that's just your money. But at least the interest of it, you're paying interest on the loan. So why wouldn't the interest portion of it be deducted?
You're paying interest on the loan, and that's for the purpose of business. The loan
Right.
was a business
Right.
expense. I mean, the interest is a business expense.
So
That you
mortgage.
could- Yeah.
So yeah, so as part of the mortgage, mortgage.
It's part of,
principal and
it's
interest.
part of the mortgage.
It's principal and interest, so the principal, okay, I hear
Part of
that
the
it's your own money, but the interest should be deducted, no?
Uh-huh. Okay, I have to, I hear the question. I have to look into that. I have to look into that. And the last question was, is a gift obligated for Ma'aser? Right, so we said before, it depends, a monetary gift or a gift of an object.
Rabbi, the raffle thing that you mentioned, that you get benefit,
The what?
the raffle.
The raffle.
But if you have a kavana from the beginning to redonate whatever you get, it's a master.
You mean whatever you're going to get, you're going to donate back. You're going to
So it's a
donate
master,
back.
You can use the master.
Yeah, so that would be okay. That would be okay. Yeah, but that's not usually the case. Especially in the lottery, right? And in the lottery, right? So, but usually that's not the case. But if that's your intention, that would be okay. Because you're doing everything here for the tzedakah. Yes.
Getting a ticket. This is a loss.
What kind of ticket? A parking ticket?
Yes. Is it deductible from your income?
That's not a business loss. If a person loses, let's say a person loses, he loses his wallet, right? So that's most poskim say